Well, it's really good to be back in the groove of Bible study again. For me, I don't know if you're like me, but when I've not done something in a while, whether it's canning, when I start canning in the summer, I have to pull out all my books and check my recipes and check everything, make sure everything's working. Or when I start in the fall, start making hot tamales again, it's like, okay, where's everything that I need? Get all the stuff out and get it ready. But when I started into Bible study working on this, I was like, how did I even do this? How did we do this overview? I'm so used to going verse by verse that how did we even do this? I had to go back and read some of the other lessons. Okay, what method did we follow? What flow did we follow? How did we even do that? So bear with me if I'm a little rusty or I'm a little scattered on this. But as I said in our review, after all the warnings from the previous prophets with the books of Daniel and Ezekiel, we've found ourselves finally in exile. Finally, God has had enough. After all the warnings, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, there will come a day when it does happen. Even today, when we read not only the prophecies in the Old Testament, but we read things in the New Testament, like in 2 Timothy and 1 and 2 Peter, and we know, and Revelation especially, we know these things will happen one day. I don't remember if it's 1 or 2 Peter, but Peter will say that people will say, oh, it's always been this way, he ain't coming back, ain't nothing ever going to change. And so they forget about the fact that there was, once one day was a flood. It came on a day, there was a day when it started raining, and it will happen. There will be that day. So now they are there. They are in exile. Daniel was taken first. In our scripture, Ezekiel comes first and then Daniel. But actually, Daniel went into exile first. Daniel went first, was taken in the first wave of deportees in 606/605 BC. You'll read all over the place. Some places it will say 606, some it will say 605. What we have to remember is that the Jewish calendar, the Jewish civil new year, begins in September. So, like this year's Bible study, this is year 2023-24. That's our semester, or that's our year of study. So we don't know exactly where within that year some of these things happen. Now in Ezekiel we were given the month, but we don't know. So it's right around that. But anytime you see that, either one of those is correct. But in that first wave, Nebuchadnezzar took we might say the best of the best. They took them to the royal palace in Babylon. As we'll see in a moment as we look at verse 1, the royalty and the best. When he took out of that first wave, he picked the very best, the nobles, the best looking, the best in everything. Then Ezekiel was taken with the craftsmen, and we might say the blue collar workers, the next best of the best that was left, and Ezekiel was taken around 598, 597 BC. And they were taken, if you looked on your map, you could see where they were taken. They were taken to the countryside. Ezekiel said he was by the river Kibar, or Chibar, I forget how you pronounce it. Kibar, I think is how it's pronounced, Chebar, Kibar. So he was taken out to the countryside, so they weren't taken to the same places. But that's how we got where we are in exile. Now, I've not taught the entire book of Daniel before, but I've taught parts of it several times, and I've read it several times. Now, Elaine will remember, Nanette, I believe you were here when we did the Advent series, and I titled that the End from the Beginning. And we used Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 as our text for that. And we went from Babylon to Bethlehem by way of the world empires. Now, when we in the Old Testament, Persia is in control. When we open in the New Testament, Rome's in control, but they're speaking Greek. How'd that happen? So we explored how we got from here to there. I think it went over well, but I know I enjoyed it anyway. But this week we will look at Daniel. We'll look at Daniel the man. We'll look at the context of history. But before we begin, what were your thoughts as you read Daniel? We're just going to cover chapters 1 through 4 this week. So what were your thoughts as you read Daniel, whether you read the entire book or you just read the first 6 verses, or anything you want to share about Daniel? You know, what your favorite account was, what your favorite chapter was, anything you want to share about reading. Questions, if you have questions. If I don't know that I'm going to get to them, we'll try to make sure we get to them in this lesson.
Like in one translation, I saw all the astrologers, whatever they were called.
Yep.
Some of them were called Chaldeans, and I had never heard that before. Mine doesn't say that. I have the New Living Translation, and it doesn't say that. But I read the ESV and the NASB, and they both had Chaldeans in there, and I wondered, does that go all the way back to like Abraham's time?
You remember, Abraham was said to come from Ur of the Chaldees.
Yeah,
that's it. It's the Babylonians that we study in Daniel are actually called the Neo-Babylonians. They're Neo meaning new, the new Babylonians. Babylonia went all the way back to Abraham and even back further than Abraham. So that area right there in what we call the Persian Gulf today, Babylonia, this map doesn't show the Persian Gulf. You have to actually look at the Persian map that's with Ezekiel to see that. But that area, well, in fact, on this map, you see Ur down toward the bottom part of Babylonia. Just a little bit to the bottom or to the right below that would be the Persian Gulf. But that area was Babylonia all the way back, way before Abraham. But they were originally called the Chaldees or the Chaldeans. But the way it's used here doesn't refer to a place as much as it does a type of people. And we'll get into who those people are.
Well, they were all grouped with the
those 4, yeah. We'll talk about who they are in a little bit. So if I don't answer that when we get there, remind me. Okay. What else?
I know this is not in today. Where does Esther come into this?
Esther, in fact, I've looked that up more than once this week just to remind myself. And I've got to do some study on timing, especially for the second half. But Esther is some 50 years later. Let's see. Let me just look here at my timeline for Esther. This book is really good with these timelines. Esther. The Daniel's 70-year captivity, the captivity of the Jewish people ends in 536 BC. That's when they get to go back. That's when Cyrus is the king, the Persian. That's when the book of Ezra starts, and they go back. And Esther is about 50 years later.
Okay.
So there is something that I read earlier today, right about the time I got ready to leave to come tonight, didn't have time to go down that rabbit trail. Something about Ahasuerus, which is what Xerxes is called in Esther, that I don't remember I think it's this Darius is the son of Ahasuerus, but it can't be that same Ahasuerus because it's not the same time frame. Ahasuerus, I'm pretty sure, is a title and not a name, because I know his name is Xerxes and his son's name is Artaxerxes. So, but about 50 years after the end of the. In fact, we'll talk about the time frame of Esther when we get into Haggai and Zechariah and those, because we're very close in that with Nehemiah. So, what else?
What struck me was how faithful Daniel was. He just and obedient.
Yeah.
He just was always right on.
Yeah, he was faithful, and I remember years ago when we did the Book of Revelation, and Janet and I were talking. Which do we do? We had talked about whether to do Daniel or Revelation, And we were back and forth on it. And I said, Daniel will teach us how to live in exile. She said, well, let's do Revelation first. We may need to do Daniel next year. I forget what year that was, but it's gotten steadily worse since then. So, but Daniel teaches us how to live in exile. And that's the application that we want to take from this book, is his faithfulness.
Do we know anything about his parents?
We don't. We know that he's probably from the royal line. But we don't know if he's from the royal line, then, all these brothers, we don't know how he fits in. But most scholars believe that he was from the house of David in one of the lines. Yeah.
That was kind of my question. When the king ordered his chief of the officials to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family, how did they know?
They would have known from where they took them from. But now what that does, it also says some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. So, possibly could have been just of the governmental officials. But most scholars believe he was of the royal family. But there had to be some way that they knew who they were. That's how they decided which ones.
Well, Daniel kind of impressed me that he wouldn't have lied to him about,
No.
who he was.
No. Even if they didn't have some designation for him,
Yeah.
and they asked him, you're right, he wouldn't have lied about it.
No.
Yeah, he would have said, like we was talking earlier in our prayer time about young men in the military. They go and they do. And Daniel was just a young man, probably mid-teenage years, but they just go and do.
Said he was about 15 years old.
That's what 15, 16-ish is. None of the commentary, nowhere in Scripture does it say for sure.
Yeah.
But calculating how long he lived, he couldn't have been much more than 15 or 16.
We say that Daniel was faithful to God. Just reverse it. God was faithful to Daniel.
Exactly. That's one of the notes that I had down. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. What else? Any other questions? Anything about what you read?
What happened to the other people? The Babylonians or the exiles, the exiled people.
Not just the other three.
No, but how many were there? Was there a great big horde?
Oh, we've got a number, but you got to go. I'm pretty sure you can find that in Ezra.
Okay.
There's somewhere that tells how many. It may be in Kings that they said how many they took total. But in Ezra, it tells us how many, once they were able to come back, how many came back. And, not all of them came back.
No.
There was Mordecai and Esther. They stayed.
Yeah.
So there were a lot that had established home. Well, in fact, in Jeremiah, God told Jeremiah to tell the people that when you get there, settle down.
Yeah.
Marry, not intermarry, but marry. Have gardens, build homes. You're going to be there for a while. And some of them, though, got so comfortable being there that they didn't come back. But we do know how many came back. I just can't tell you that off the top of my head.
So Nebuchadnezzar was very picky.
He was.
About who he took.
Yeah, he was.
In other words, he just didn't take anybody.
He didn't just round up anybody who was running loose.
Okay.
He was methodical in who he took and why he took them. Now, in that second wave of Ezekiel, when he took them out to the countryside, that was an entirely different group of people, and he took them out to work. They had skills, they had all these abilities, and he specifically, the fact that Ezekiel is a priest didn't play anything into the way that he took it. But the others that they took out to the countryside or the rural area, he may have taken him as a priest because he was responsible for people, or in leadership position. But all of those that they took out there, they took because they put them to work. Just like you would any slaves that you capture or whatever.
But these choice ones, they really intended to change them completely into their nationality, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly what they planned to do. Yeah.
I had never picked up on, first of all, in the first chapter where it talks about the ones they were choosing, and Nebuchadnezzar was choosing that they were good looking, no defects, and showing intelligent. How did they show their intelligence? In every branch of wisdom. I didn't know wisdom had branches, so. Endowed with understanding. I mean, how did they know?
I don't know if and we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to it. But I don't know if they had some sort of test that they did, or if they just, they just appeared, the way they carried themselves. I don't really know.
Yeah. It's just interesting how that was explained.
Yeah, I think there's something behind the things specifically that they were looking for. We'll talk about that in a minute.
I wonder if they were of noble, then they were educated.
Yeah, they probably were more. They probably could read. If they were of the nobles, they probably could read.
Yeah, so maybe that was part of it, but who knows?
Yeah.
I mean,
like I said, I've taught parts of this many times, and I've read Daniel many times. But still, every time that I read it, even late this afternoon, reading over it again, I still picked up on things that I hadn't seen before. Just the way that it worded, it just jumped out at me and I thought, I can't chase that right now.
I thought the first 5 or 6 chapters were just fascinating. But then it just started making my head get real scrambled over in the prophecy.
Yeah, when we get over to that, we're gonna have fun next week. We just put it that way. So.
Well, Daniel resolved. He'd already made up his mind that he wasn't going to. I mean, he must have had good parents and good upbringing for him to have already resolved not to eat, first of all, the king's fat foods, and to just follow what he's always known, but then to still stand up for the God that he trusted and believed in. So he's had an experience in his young 15, 16 years already. But it's interesting when they had that decree that they were coming out to look for Daniel and his friends to kill them.
Yeah.
I never equated them being in that bowl of, these guys are...
Well, they had put them in to these that were being taught these what would we call?
For 3 years.
These arts, I don't want to particularly say occultic arts, but they were specifically put in that group to learn those things.
That, but I hadn't really thought about them being in with them because when the first time we wanted the dream interpreted, okay, y'all can't do it, I'm going to kill you. And then Daniel's like, okay, then we do it.
Well, I wonder too if the food that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to feed them was also not kosher.
Probably wasn't.
Or there were pigs or whatever. They had pork or whatever, and Daniel just said, "I'm not. We're not going to eat that." It's
like they put. Of course, I can't eat pork now, but it would be like somebody putting in front of you a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich and say, "I'm going to force you to eat it." Well, okay, if I have to,
Yeah.
But that was it. Some of them may have looked on it as the excuse of, well, they're making me do it. I mean, if you got to eat it, if I've got to eat this cheesecake, I've got to eat this cheesecake. But, you hold the gun on me while I eat it now. But Daniel said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I mean, we're just in the Amy and Amy on the end. How about that? So we're talking about reading through. If there's any questions, anything you want to share about what you've read, we're just doing our response to the reading of the book.
So it sounded like all they ate was fruit and vegetables.
Yeah. And water.
And water.
Yeah, not the king's fine wines. Yeah, and there was nothing wrong with drinking wine because they would have had it, for their Passovers and all their other things. But it was not the king's wine. They just give us water and just give us this.
Well, and I think that's what we all supposed to be eating according to Genesis when Adam and Eve started?
Well, it was until the flood.
Yeah. I
But-
mean, I just felt like that he was still, again, his roots of,
Yep.
of what he knew. But,
Yep.
And then what's always intrigued me is about this furnace, because they heat it up 7 times hotter than it's normally done. So they're able to put them in there without them getting singed. So, you know, Shadrach, Meshach,
Well, they
and
died
Abednego.
getting put in.
And somebody dies
Putting them in.
putting them in.
Yeah.
But Nebuchadnezzar can go and look in there and see the 4th person, and I don't know where he went or saw.
Yeah.
Or how this
I don't know if there's like an opening that you could look in and not have to be right at it. The way I imagine it, was you would go up some sort of steps to go to it, because as they went to put them in, the others died.
Yeah. And the NASB says they fell into the midst of the furnace,
Mm-hmm.
which is not in the NIV as far as the wording of that. So it's almost as if they're there but not there. Like they're.
Well, when I think of the midst, I just think down in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
What they use the furnace for? Just to burn people, or was it used for someone to pray?
Oh, that was the.
Is it bricks?
Oh, wait a minute. Let me find it. Tell me, where's that? Give it.
Chapter 3, verse 19.
Not at the end where I put it for you.
Okay. In the midst, go back to verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Now, we know that they did have these, of course, y'all may have seen the picture in the old Bible story books. I'm going to talk about story here in a minute, but in the old Bible story books of Molech, where they did the child sacrifice,
Yeah.
I just imagined it was kind of a same kind of a thing. They used it for sacrifices. I don't think it was like, hey, let's use the brick furnace to do this with, I don't think it had another purpose, and then they just decided to throw them into it. I think that this furnace was there for that reason, for human sacrifice. That's another thing that I'll have to look up. I didn't get to that.
And they weren't delivered from their trial. They had
No.
to go through it.
Through it, not from it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And how many different opinions are there of who the 4th person was?
Let's hold that till we get over to that.
Okay.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Anything else on reading through it?
We may be in this longer.
No. Well, this is just an overview, so we can't go too far in detail. We'll add this to the list of those we want to do verse by verse. So, anything else on just reading over these first 6 chapters?
Okay, so when I was reading through it, where is it when the son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, takes over?
Mm-hmm.
His name is close to
Belshazzar.
I got
Yeah.
And Daniel's is Belteshazzar.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had to reread it. I'm like, wait a minute. Daniel's like, no, that's not his dad.
Right.
Well, is it
Yeah,
his
I-
dad?
Right.
when they said
You're
he
right.
died, I said,
That's-
Daniel didn't die.
I
know.
That's the part that we'll cover next time. We're doing chapters 1 through 6 this time. That's it.
That's in.
Oh, you're right. It's,
Yeah.
it's in 5. You're right. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot. He throws that in. Yeah. The name, and I didn't write this down. Let's see.
Belshazzar.
Did I say that on the Daniel's name? Okay, yeah, up at the top. Daniel's name, his Hebrew name means God is my judge. His Babylonian name is
there's some extra.
Belteshazzar, which
Okay.
means Bel, protect his life. But this man that you're talking about, Belshazzar, takes his name from this same God. I didn't look up what that name meant, but he gets his name from that same God. Just like Abednego, Azariah's name is changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nego or Nebo, who is the god of literature and science. And Nebuchadnezzar's name comes from that god too. So they were named after their gods, and when they changed these Hebrew children's names, they changed them to names that were similar to or exalted their gods. Does that clear that up? Okay. Yeah, because Belshazzar is also mentioned in the second half too, is what I was thinking. I forgot that. All right. Anything else? And you know, if we don't get through with this with what I've got, that's fine. If you've got questions, we want to share and we want to talk about it. But I'll go on give you an introduction to the book, some of the background to it, and then we're going to talk about the scripture a little bit. Daniel is one of those books that we may know a little bit more about than others in the Old Testament. Not that we understand it more, or not that we understand the prophecies, but at least we've heard some of these things. I really want to try to leave plenty of time for questions, and especially next week, we're going to be talking about prophecy the entire lesson next week. So as you're reading next week's scripture, jot down your questions, any question you have, and that's where you'll look at this chart a little bit, this Daniel 70 weeks chart. But I may not do I'm not going to cover more about Daniel in the background again. We'll just talk about prophecy next week. We just may have just a free flow discussion about that next time. As I said on your overview sheet, the book of Daniel is what's called apocalyptic literature. Now, the word apocalyptic, it's not a fearful word. The word simply means unveiling. The book of Revelation simply is the apocalypse, but the word simply means an unveiling. Many things are veiled in this book, and with many of them, once it's unveiled, we still may not know much about it, but at least it's there for all to see. We've talked before, the book of Daniel goes along with the book of Revelation. Those two books just fit together. We've talked before about Revelation being the picture on the box, on the jigsaw puzzle box. You know, Old Testament prophecies, all these pieces, you dump out the pieces out of the jigsaw box. Revelation is the picture on the box. Tells us where all the parts go. But if Revelation is the picture on the box, Daniel is the corner pieces and the outline the flat pieces. Daniel's what gives us our parameters. It's what gives us our outline of the picture. We don't fill in all the pieces till we get to Revelation, but this gives us the outline. Some of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature, which not only in Daniel and Revelation, but we'll also see some of this in Ezekiel and Zechariah as we go along. But here's some things to look for in apocalyptic literature. In apocalyptic literature, the person who receives God's truth in vision records what he saw. John recorded the visions that he saw. Zechariah recorded the visions that he saw. Ezekiel recorded, and Daniel recorded the visions that he saw. Apocalyptic literature makes extensive use of signs and symbols. I mean, you read some of these weird things in this book, all these animals and, all that weird stuff. Yeah, signs and symbols. Apocalyptic literature normally gives revelation concerning God's program this is important, for the future of his people Israel. Now, it will concern the Gentiles. It will concern the nations. But it is for Israel, just like everything else in this book. First of all, is for Israel. And we've seen in the other prophets, we've seen that they use a lot of Hebrew poetry, but apocalyptic literature is almost always narrative. It's telling a story.
Will you repeat that last one you just said? Is Revelation?
Which one?
The last one you just said.
Just Revelation.
Okay, apocalyptic literature normally gives revelation concerning God's program for the future of Israel. In Revelation, well, in all of them, Ezekiel, Revelation, Daniel, Zechariah, the picture, the unveiling has to do with Gentile nations, but it is for Israel. These kingdoms here in chapter 2, all this statute and all these kingdoms, they are world Gentile kingdoms, but they affect Israel. Now, I don't remember if it's in Daniel or if it's in one of the other prophets, later on prophets, maybe Zechariah. But something says, anytime you hear something about 4 world empires, there's only 4 world empires. Well, we're like, okay, what about the Scythians, and what about the Gauls, and what about China? When it says there's only 4 world empires, we're talking, biblically speaking, it's the 4 world empires that affect Israel. Now, sometimes it will say 5, and when it's 5, then it counts Egypt. But generally, it's from Daniel on. It's the 4 world empires that affect Israel. So apocalyptic literature gives revelation concerning God's program for the future of his people Israel. Is that it? Okay, as you probably know, we've talked about this a little bit before. The book of Daniel is greatly disputed as to time, date, and author. You'll run into that everywhere you go. Now, I don't want to take a lot of time with this, and if you have questions about it, I've got some information on it. I've actually got 2 books with the same title, Daniel in the Critic's Den, that answers any question you might have about when Daniel was written and why. When, where, why, and who wrote the book. We've got all the answers right here. But many of the reasons, that it's disputed, one is that the book, of course we can't tell it in our English language, but the book is written in 2 languages. In its original writing, it was in 2 languages. Part of it is in Hebrew, part of it is in Aramaic. Chapters 1 through 2, verse 4a is in Hebrew. Chapters, as well as chapters 8 through 12 is in Hebrew. That's the language of God's covenant people. Chapter 2, beginning with verse 4b all the way through chapter 7, are in Aramaic, which is the language of Gentile people. It's the language that was spoken there, just like we've talked before about Koine Greek, and like English today. And that's the universal language. Koine Greek could be spoken all over the world because it was the language of the merchant. It was, in order to buy and sell, you had to be able to speak Koine. I remember that because Koine reminds me of coins. Koine Greek wasn't classical Greek. But Aramaic in this time frame, this era, and if Jesus spoke in Aramaic, they were not speaking primarily in Hebrew in Jesus' day. They were primarily speaking in either Aramaic or Greek. Remember, when Jesus was crucified, what they put on the thing above the cross was in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So they were still speaking Aramaic in that day. The book is one single book. Doesn't have 2 halves. It's not by 2 authors. It's not by 2 time periods. It's one single book, but it has 2 different emphases. It is God's plan for the Gentile nations. That part is written in Aramaic. And God's plan for the nation of Israel. That part's written in Hebrew. It's like we talked in our beginning introduction and then last time in the review, and that is that river of humanity. This is one of those times that there's an interaction with the river of humanity and that tributary from Abraham's descendants. Other questions that arise are, was it written in the 6th century BC or the 2nd century BC? Was it written by Daniel, or was it written by someone who called himself Daniel? And we could say, does it matter? Sure, it matters. You might say, well, why do I need to know that? I believe it's Daniel wrote it, and I believe it was written at the time that Daniel says it was written. Why do I even need to know that? Why is that even important? Well, it's important because, first of all, you have to know, you need to know that so that you know how accurate prophecy is. This biblical prophecy, everything that, you got to remember, everything that Daniel was writing is future. The prophecy is future. Now, to us, a lot of it is history. These kingdoms of Greece, and then Persia, and then Rome, and that is history. There's still a future nation going to arise. That part's still future. I don't remember which book I was looking in, but one of the commentaries we've often talked about seeing the mountaintop peaks of prophecy, and we don't see the space in between, and it was like it had Daniel here and lines drawn out to the things that he could see out in the future. He saw a lot of mountain peaks out there, but he had no idea how it was going to come about. We can look back and see how some of it came about. But here's the most important reason. You need to know this in order to be able to share it with others. Your kids and your grandkids are watching the History Channel. They're watching A&E. They're watching programs like Mysteries of the Bible. They're being told that none of this is true, that this is just all stories, it's just made up, or he wrote it long after it had already taken place. You need to be able to say, that's not right. You need to know how to answer that, and you need to know what happened so that we will know what will happen in the future. We can see a lot of things, as the saying goes, not falling apart, but falling into place. All of this in Daniel, as I said, was written well in advance of it happening. But here's the thing. It is so accurate and it is so detailed that the critics point to its accuracy as proof that it's a forgery. Circular logic. It can't be true because it's true.
Oh.
Yeah.
It can't be true. It couldn't have been written by Daniel because it all happened.
So somebody wrote it after.
Somebody wrote it afterward. Antiochus Epiphanes, when he comes in and does his thing, Daniel couldn't have wrote about that, just like Isaiah couldn't have named Cyrus by name, 200 years before he was born. The critic says that couldn't possibly happen. But you need to know that. And you need to know how to answer that. It can't be true because it's true. So, you know where I stand on this, and I know where you stand on this. If you have other questions about the specifics, we can talk about that later. I believe that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. I believe it so much so that the book of Daniel is the criteria for which I judge every commentary that I buy, if it's a whole commentary. Because I want to know what a writer says about Daniel. If I don't like what he says about Daniel, I don't want to hear anything he has to say about anything else.
Don't waste your time.
I'm not going to waste my time. I've only got a finite amount of time to read and resources to buy books, so I'm not. Now, I've got a couple that somebody gave me that go off down that other trail, and I've picked up some things from them that's interesting, but I seldom even pull those books out. But there are a lot of reasons why I believe that, but chief among the reasons, and this is your good bottom line reason, is that in Daniel 24 verse 15, Jesus calls him Daniel the prophet. Mm-hmm. That's good enough for me right there. If I didn't know anything else, I know that. The internal evidence, though, for Daniel as the author is that more than a dozen times we read where he writes, I, Daniel did this. I, Daniel did that. I, Daniel saw this. I felt that. Or whatever event he's describing, he puts himself in the middle of the action. It's autobiographical as he writes it. Ezekiel mentions Daniel along with Job and Noah. So, he was a well-known person. He's a real person. He's a real historical person, and this is his story. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned this. I know I've mentioned it in our Sunday school class because we talked about Ken Ham in the Creation Museum. But I don't know if I remember if I mentioned this last week or not. I know I did Tuesday night. But Ken Ham recently did a... did I tell this last week? Do you remember?
You did Tuesday night.
I know I did Tuesday night. Ken Ham put this article and actually had a video. I watched his video. Ken Ham said, we talk about, when we talk about the Bible, we talk about Bible stories. What does the world think when they hear the word stories?
It's not real.
Not real. It's fiction. It's just a story. Let me tell you a Bible story. Does that sound like something that's real? Now, you and I know it's real. We've been raised with it being real, but if you say to someone or a child that it does not have Bible background, Bible grounding, let me tell you a Bible story, what's that equate to? A fairy tale. Let me tell you a bedtime story. So I've been really, really working on myself to not call it story anymore. I'm trying to call it accounts because it is real and it is historical and everything in this book happened. They're real people, everyday human breathing people just like we are. So they're not just stories. This is a record of accounts of events. So, let's talk about the man for just a few minutes. But any questions on that part of the background?
How did Noah know about Daniel?
No, Noah didn't know about Daniel. Ezekiel.
Oh.
Ezekiel knew about Noah.
Oh, okay.
And Job were the other two characters that he mentioned. Okay. In addition to Daniel. In the Preacher's Commentary series, I happened to pick this one up and begin looking at it yesterday afternoon. Sinclair Ferguson, I don't know if any of you ever heard him preach. He's, if you listen to Joy 62, he sometimes is on Ligonier Ministries, R.C. Sproul's program. Sinclair Ferguson wrote the commentary that's in the Preacher's Commentary series, and he's from Scotland. He has that really cool Scottish brogue. I love listening to him. But he begins his commentary this way. He said, to open the book of Daniel is to enter a strange but brave new world. I thought, that's good. That is exactly what it is. The book of Daniel is a book about a man taken into captivity as a young boy, probably, as we've said, mid-teens. And it's a book about his commitment to remain faithful to God, and as we said earlier, about God's faithfulness to him. It wasn't a one-sided deal. And it lasted, he was faithful to God, and God was faithful to him through his entire life. We know from chapter 10, verse 1, that Daniel lived at least until 536 BC, when Cyrus the Persian came on the scene. That's 70 years after where we are right here. If Daniel was 15 or 16, that makes him 85, 86. And many scholars believe that he lived well beyond that, even into his 90s. Imagine the things that he saw over his life. Some scholars were like, well, Daniel didn't want to go back home, after they were released and could go. Can you imagine, look at that man, can you imagine making that trip when you're 90 years old? No wonder he didn't go back. But he lived that long and saw all of that. The time of Daniel is similar, though, and I didn't put these two together until just recently. The time of Daniel is similar to the times of the book of Exodus, in that the Israelites are in slavery. In both cases, they're in slavery. In Exodus, it appears that their God has been powerless to feed them during the famine, and they had to go down to Egypt, and now their God is powerless to be able to get them out of slavery. But then we know that every one of those 10 plagues that come upon Egypt is in direct opposition to one of their gods. So that proves God is more powerful than their gods. In this case, it appears Nebuchadnezzar just waltzed right in and took over, destroyed, after the third wave, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple. And where was God while he was doing that? It appears that God is powerless against these multitude of gods of the Babylonians. But the book of Daniel teaches us that God is sovereign over all the nations. All we know about Daniel, the boy, is found in chapter 1. As we said, he's not even mentioned by name until you get to verse 6. We don't know anything about his family. We do know that he's from the royal family, and we know that he was a sharp young man. Chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 tells us, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the officials, or the chief eunuch, to bring in some of, now he didn't even bring all of them, they picked and chose out of what they had. Some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. And here we go. This describes them. Youth in whom was no defect. Keep count here now. No defect. Who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding, and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. There had to be something about them, their presence, their knowledge, something about them that caused them to be chosen, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him, Nebuchadnezzar ordered Ashpenaz, to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Now, how many things were there?
6.
6. Do you know what the number 6 represents in Hebrew literature?
Not good.
It's not good. 6
you
is...
think of 666,
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, the number 6 is the number of man. Man was created on the 6th day. It's the number of man, which tells us these are the things that man looks at in another human being. What does God look at?
The heart.
The heart. Remember Saul? They wanted Saul to be king because he was tall and he was good looking and he had good presence and all this. No. And then there was David. You know, all the brothers came in and Samuel says, is this all you got? Well, there's David, but God looks on the heart. He doesn't look on these external things that Nebuchadnezzar looked at and was the requirements for his choice. Daniel's not called a prophet anywhere within the book. God didn't give him a message to deliver, like we've seen in the other lessons. Nowhere do we read of his calling or the word of the Lord came to Daniel, or the burden of Daniel, the oracle of Daniel, nothing like we did the other prophets. Every other prophet that we studied, and all of the next ones that we will study, will be called by God for a purpose, but not Daniel. Doesn't say anything specifically about Daniel being raised up. Every other prophet was raised up specifically with a message for his generation, but not Daniel. Daniel was just living life in captivity. One commentary said Daniel did not occupy the prophetic office, but he had the prophetic gift. But even with all this prophecy in the book, it reads more like a biography, doesn't it? We're reading about Daniel. We learn about how he stood, how he was faithful all these years, and like we said, God's faithfulness to him. But all these situations that he found himself in, how he reacted to them. I mean, it's a treasure trove for application, for any pastor that wants to tell you how to live in hard times. But that's what Daniel did. Daniel was truly God's messenger with the truths that God disclosed to him, whether he had the title of prophet or not. But like we said, Jesus called him prophet, and that's good enough. The book of Daniel, like Revelation, is not a straight line book, and you already picked up on that, Amy, because of throwing in Belshazzar right in the middle of things. I mean, it goes out and it comes back, and it's not a straight line chronologically speaking. We talked, if you remember, if you were with us when we studied Matthew. Matthew generally moves from Jesus' birth to his ascension, but Matthew groups events. It's everything that happens in Matthew does not happen in a strict chronological order. Well, that's the way it is with the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation too. There are things that happen, and then you have something else that's brought in, and then it goes back to the original timeline, which can be really confusing unless you make notes of where you are and you're right. Did Daniel become king? You can have those questions. You gotta make notes so you keep yourself straight on that. As I was reading this, I was thinking Daniel generally moves from the beginning of his life to the end of his life, but he groups events and he inserts things into the narrative. By the way, you need to know this. And so he shares that, and it's like, I mean, I do this all the time. You know I do this. You're telling a story, and you think of something else that needs to be said in the middle of that story, and you'll say, now hold that thought. You tell this other thing, and then, you come back to where you were. My mother used to say I had to go all the way around the barn to tell whatever it was I was going to tell. I said, well, these other things are important. You need to know that to make this story work. But chapters 1 through 6 are historical or biographical in nature, but they contain some prophecy. Chapters 7 through 12 are more prophetic, but they contain some personal and biographical things too. So you have sort of a division, but you have a mixture of those things. So you might want to jot this down. Now I'll give you an overall outline of the book. An overall outline of the book might go something like this. Chapter 1 gives us the setting in history and sets the stage for the book. Chapter 1 gives us the setting in history and sets the stage for the book. Chapters 2 through 7 are the core of the book. Chapters 2 and 7 are pictures of world empires. Chapter 2 is from man's viewpoint, all that, that statue of gold and all the beautiful parts of it. Chapter 7 is world empires from God's viewpoint. That's those hideous looking beasts that we see. Those two things are the same prophecy.
World empire from God's.
From God's view. Chapter 7 is world empires from God's view. Okay? Chapters 3 and 6 are narratives of a divine deliverance in a mighty and unmistakable way.
Could you repeat that?
Chapters 3 and 6 are narratives or stories, accounts. They are accounts of divine deliverance in a mighty and unmistakable way. And now I'll tell you what those are when you're ready. Okay, chapter 3 is the fiery furnace. And chapter 6 is Daniel and the lion's den. And as we talked about earlier with those that were, when they threw Daniel in, and they got killed, or threw the 3 Hebrew children into the furnace, the ones that threw them in got killed, but the 3 Hebrew children weren't hurt. In Daniel's case, the same thing happened. Daniel was preserved. God shut the lions' mouths, but the ones who accused him got thrown in, and it says they were crushed and eaten before they hit the ground.
Right.
And their families too.
And their families too. Yeah.
Children. That's what
Yeah.
bothered me.
Yeah. Everything. Yeah. Chapters 4 and 5 give us God's judgment on world rulers who don't acknowledge God.
Say that again.
Chapters 4 and 5 give us God's judgment on world rulers who don't acknowledge God. In chapter 4, it's Nebuchadnezzar when he says, look at what I've done. And chapter 5, it's Belshazzar with using all the vessels from the temple in his drunken party. If you need me to repeat any of that, just let me know. This is in one of our earlier last year. One of our prophets, we said the book was arranged in a chiastic structure where these 2 parts fit and these 2 parts fit and these 2 parts. That's exactly what this is. 2 and 7 is the same picture. 3 and 6 are the same picture. 4 and 5 are the same picture. That's the reason they're arranged the way they are.
It's almost like a hyperlink back to Genesis 1.
Yeah, exactly. Everything goes with something else. That's exactly right. Just a little quick note: the entire Bible's that way.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other story in itself.
That's another rabbit trail.
Yeah, and then finally, the last of that outline, chapters 8 through 12, give us the setting of the closing of history. All of chapters 8 through 12 is one, although there are some different things thrown in, but overall it's the closing of history. So we have the setting in history as the book begins, and we have the closing of history as the book ends. So any questions on that part or comments? Well, as I was looking at this, I thought, I don't know exactly how to do this because we obviously can't cover it verse by verse, and I'm not going to read it to you. And you know a lot of the story anyway, but there are still a lot of things in here that we need to notice and pull out. So I'm just going to kind of go over these first 6 chapters. If there's something you wanted to pull out or something that struck you that you didn't mention earlier, or if you want to reiterate that or have a question about something, feel free to speak up. So we begin by looking at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now, we know from secular history when this happened. In these 2 verses, we have both history and we have theology. We know that Nebuchadnezzar did something, and we know that God did something. As I said, we know from secular history exactly when this happened. It happened in 606/605 BC. Jehoiakim, Josiah's oldest son, was king of Judah. We read about him in the book of Jeremiah. He wasn't, as you remember, Judah's first choice of king when Josiah got killed. Josiah's youngest son was made king because he was as lax and as corrupt as the rest of them were. But he didn't last long, and so Jehoiakim was placed king. Lots and lots of history in there that I would love to have time to share, but we just don't have time. But it was during that time that Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem, and in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he took Jerusalem. He took the people captive, and he took the spoils to the house of his gods. And we're talking about silver and gold vessels. To him, they meant nothing other than monetary value, and so he took them into the treasury of his gods. But verse 2 tells us that it was actually God who gave these things to Nebuchadnezzar. And let me throw this out, one of them round the barn kind of things. When we studied the book of Revelation, one of the things that really amazed me about the book of Revelation was the number of times that we read that someone gave someone something. They were given the keys to the bottomless pit. They were given I can't remember them off the top of my head, but you just go through Revelation just looking for the phrase given to or gave to. And ultimately, in every case, you will see that God was in control. God gave something to one of the angels who gave it, or this angel gave, but it all came from God. God was in control. God gave everything. Well, as I began reading this, I began to see that same thing come up in the book here of Daniel. It was the number of things that were given to. In verse 2 there, we just read, the Lord gave, God's in control, gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. We find it again down there in verse 9. God gave, or God granted Daniel hesed, or favor and compassion in the sight of the official. In verse 17 of chapter 1, these 4 youths, God gave them the knowledge and the intelligence of all this literature and wisdom and all these things. In chapter 2, verse 21, Daniel said God gives wisdom to the wise man. He raises up kings and he takes down kings, and he gives wisdom to the wise man. In verse 23, he said, you, O God, my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me the wisdom and power. Verses 37 and 38 of chapter 2. He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says about this dream, and he says, you, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. You think you've done all this, you've defeated all these enemies, you think you've done all this on your own, but we know from Habakkuk that God was going to do this, and now we see Daniel said God did this. He gave you all this. Verse 38, wherever sons of men dwell, or beasts of the field, or birds of the air, he has given them into your hand. God is in control of all this. And then one more, there's probably more, but just the next one I saw was in chapter 5, verse 18. And he's talking here to Belshazzar after that handwriting on the wall. And he says, O king, the Most High God granted or gave to you sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and master. Granted the sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. It was his ancestor. It wasn't his actual father. But all these things, you can go back to chapter 1, all these things, God gave it. What we see in this is God in control of everything. This history and this theology in verses 1 and 2 gives us 2 views of the same event. This can be called a Christian or a God-centered worldview and a secular worldview. There's only 2 worldviews. You either have a God or Christian worldview, or you have a secular worldview. There are no others. That's the only 2 that there are. Everything that we see today, you and I, everything that we see today is colored by our worldview. No event in history can be isolated apart from God's sovereignty. The more I study Scripture, the more I have a God or Christ-centered worldview. The more we sometimes talk about, well, Janet called it God winks. We call it coincidence. The quote goes, coincidence is when God works but prefers to remain anonymous. And I should have gone back and looked at it. Which one of the Beatitudes is it? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Not only see God when the time comes, but they'll see God's hand in everything. You look back at history. George Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve. A fog arose over the Delaware, and there had never been fog at that time of year in that place. Now you tell me God wasn't in control of that. I could go on, I could give you a lot of events, World War II and these things, but the bottom line is, if you have a God-centered worldview, you will see God's hand in all these things. Now back to verse 2. Look at where Nebuchadnezzar took the spoils of war. My translation says he took them to the land of Shinar. Does anybody else say anything different?
To Babylon.
Yours says Babylon? Well, you could say, if you were reading that and you weren't using a translation that said Babylon, we know they're in Babylon, but what's the deal about Shinar?
Yeah.
Well, Shinar, Genesis 11 verse 2 tells us that that's where Nimrod built the Tower of Babel, in the land of Shinar. This whole land on that map, that whole Babylonian land, the further Old Testament, the early name for it was the land of Shinar. So that's where he took them. But God gave these things to Nebuchadnezzar, as we saw in Jeremiah. The Lord himself was involved in the defeat of his own people. God said this is going to happen, and God brought it on. Why would God do such a thing? Why would God allow that? And think about Daniel. Daniel is writing this down. How could Daniel say such a thing?
God told him.
God told him. Whether or not God spoke to him in that, and we believe it is God breathed, but he knew it. He knew that God was in control, and he had known what the other prophets had taught. All these prophets that we've covered. They kept warning and kept warning, and finally, it came to be. Well, why do you think, why did God want Daniel in Babylon? Why take Daniel there? What's the point? What good could possibly come out of Daniel being in Babylon?
Show who God is.
Show who God is.
Testimony.
The testimony, the things that Daniel shared. Prophecy. The prophecies that he was given.
Just how to keep it together when you're in.
That's an excellent one. The application of how Daniel lived. You and I are not quite in exile yet, but I think we're getting close. And I think the book of Daniel will help us to remain faithful. But there's one other thing that Daniel's writing, Daniel's being there, being a part of these magicians and conjurers and astrologers and all that, and that is, remember Matthew chapter 2? Who is it that shows up in Bethlehem?
The wise men.
The wise men who are the,
Astrologers.
what do we call them? The Magi. Magi. Comes from that word, we pronounce it magician, but it really is Magian. They are from the Medes. They are from the Chaldeans. They are these priests of the Chaldeans, the Magi. And this is who Daniel is a part of, and Daniel's prophecies that Daniel is told to write down, but he's told to what? Seal up the book. But they have the book. And so these Magi, some 600 years late, if Daniel's later, at least 500 years later, have Daniel's writings that say the king is going to be born in Bethlehem. And so Daniel was there for many purposes, many reasons, but that I think is one of the big ones. So hitting the high points of these chapters. I wrote down how were these youth treated, but I don't know why I wrote that. But anyway, they were given the food. I mean, you know these stories, these accounts. Yeah, we can call them stories because we know, but we know these accounts. One of the things that particularly of this first chapter, they were given, they appointed this daily ration, and they didn't take it. We talked about that, and they should be educated. Verse 5 says for 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, they were to enter the king's personal service. And now among them, the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We always think of them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's their that's their Babylonian names. And their names were changed to Babylonian names because when you change somebody's name, you change their identity. So they gave them names pertaining to their God, trying to wipe out their history. When we read about Nebuchadnezzar talking to, and Belshazzar also talking to Daniel, they call him Belteshazzar. But when Daniel's talking about himself, he calls himself Daniel. I mean, he hung on to that.
That would be all have your name changed.
Huh?
That would be all have your name changed.
Yeah.
And basically you are, I don't know, I can't think of the word now, but I mean, you are indoctrinated.
Yeah, they were definitely indoctrinated.
Years,
yeah.
You're not called, Hananiah or whatever. You're called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you're just thinking, okay, I'm Babylonian now.
Yeah. It says it's a bad thing.
3 years.
This is a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing. We think about Abram being changed to Abraham and Jacob being changed to Isaac. And I think every one of us changed our last names. Yeah. I don't think anybody here has a hyphenated name, do you? But we kept our, we changed our names. That was a good thing. But it changes your identity. It changes who you are. In this case, it was done to indoctrinate them, to wipe out their history. Well, we know that at least these 4 didn't. They hung on to that.
Boy, God was really with them.
Oh, yeah.
For 3 years?
Just 3 years.
For
just
3 years to have that pounded into you?
Yeah. Well, that's why I pray so much for our school teachers, because we see what's going on in the rest of the world and how our kids are being indoctrinated with things. I mean, I've known some excellent teachers, a couple of you here, but, I've prayed for teachers for years, but it's different today. I remember Cheryl Hickman one time telling me, I forget what she was talking about teaching. She said, "You'd be amazed at how much time I can spend on the Middle East." so I can imagine what she was getting in there. But there they were. See, now we wanted to talk about where were those branches. It was that early in the. Okay, I think the first time we see it is in verse 20 of chapter 1. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah entered the king's personal service because they ate the food and they were healthy and they were better than anyone else. But as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them, these 4, 10 times better than all the magicians or the Magians and conjurers who were all in his realm. And your different translations will have different names for them. Sometimes they're called astrologers, sometimes they're called diviners. There's a total of 4 of them. And they're used throughout that. And then verse 21, we can almost put a parenthesis around it because it lays out the history. Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king, and that's 70 years later. So Daniel is saying the rest of this book, the rest of what I'm going to write, Daniel continued serving for 70 years. Verse 20 is where the New American Standard calls it conjurers. The King James calls it astrologers. astrologers, and the New Living Translation calls it enchanters. In chapter 2, verse 2 is where we get them again, because we have that account of that nightmare that he had, and you know that account. He had this dream, and some scholars say, well, he couldn't remember the dream, and he wanted them to tell him the dream and then tell him what it meant. I think he knew exactly what the dream was, but he wanted to make sure that they were not just making up answers. So he wasn't going to tell them what it was. They had to tell him the dream and tell him what it meant. In verse 2, it says he gave orders to call these four ranks of the Magi. The 4 ranks were the Magians, that was the head one. It's you go back to verse 20 of chapter 1, these 4 were 10 times greater. But he called in all of them, not just Daniel and his 3 friends, but all of them, all that he had in his kingdom. The Magians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. These were all, as I said, different ranks of these Magi. They wanted to tell him the dream, and they came in. Of course, they couldn't tell him the dream. And then chapter 2, verse 4, that first line is in Hebrew. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, and from there on through chapter 7 is all Aramaic. And they say to him, what's the first thing you say to the king? "O king, live forever."
Yeah.
I mean, Esther did that when she came in before the king. They all do that. "O king, live forever. Tell us the dream, and we'll declare its interpretation." And you know how that account goes. He gets angry with them. Verse 5 says, "If you can't make it known to me, you'll be torn limb from limb. Your houses will be made a rubbish heap." He's just angry, and so they won't push him any further than that. But they finally, he says, this is what I read when we get down to verse 12. They kept trying, arguing with him. In verse 12, he says, because the king became indignant and very furious, he gave orders, just kill them all, off with their heads. Just kill them all. They're not going to tell me anything, just kill them all. So they come in, and they're going to kill, Arioch comes in, they're going to kill Daniel, and Daniel said, "Wait a minute, what did I do?" And so he tells him, and Daniel says, "Give me a minute," And so Daniel, as you know, talks to his friends, and they pray about it overnight. In verse 19, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And then what's the first thing Daniel does before he tells Arioch? He prays a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer of praise. Because God is the one that gave him this, and he knew that. Verse 23, "You have given me wisdom and power." Then he goes to Arioch, and Arioch goes to the king and says, "Hey, I found somebody." "Yeah, right. You didn't find anybody. Daniel come and told you." And so, verse 28, "There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days." And so he tells him the dream. And we see this pattern over and over in Scripture, where they first tell you something and then explain it, or they give directions for something and then they actually do it. But in the first part of this, beginning in verse 21 or 31, he relates the dream to it, and then on down there, beginning in verse 37. He tells him what the dream means, and he basically repeats the parts again. But here, this is the picture of world empires, as we said earlier, from man's point of view. Man's point of view of the world is, everything's great, and it's gold, and it's, all gold and glitter and glitz, and everything's wonderful. And so you have the head of gold and the arms of silver, and then bronze, and we could go into a lot of detail on what each of those metals are for, and what they depict, and all that. But we know that that's the empires, and Daniel tells him that it's the empires of Babylon, and then the one that follows after that. We know from history that the one that follows after that is Persia, the one that follows after that is Greece, and the one that follows after that is Rome. It plays out perfectly. And then I love verse 46 of chapter 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel. How cool is that? He said, give him anything he wants. Yeah, I don't care. Give him anything he wants. But now here's something I want you to think about. So he tells Daniel, your God is the greatest God there is, and he promoted Daniel and going to make you ruler over all the province and all this. And Daniel says, wait a minute, I got a question, I got a request for you. So I've got these 3 friends. He said, made the request, verse 49, that Nebuchadnezzar appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon. Now Daniel's made it just says ruler here, over the entire area. But make them part of the administration over just this province while Daniel's in the king's court. That's going to be important in a minute. My question to you is, knowing what's going to happen in chapter 3 with this image of gold, do you think Nebuchadnezzar even listened to what Daniel asked him? Did he even know who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were? No. We know that from chapter 3 because when they won't bow down, he doesn't say, oh no, that's Daniel's friends. It'll be okay. No, it's just off with their heads, throw them into the furnace. I think when Daniel asked that, he was just like, oh yeah, anything you want, that's fine. And he's on to something else. I think he doesn't pay any attention at all.
You think that's why Daniel wasn't included with the 3 in the furnace?
No, I think the reason is I think they were in 2 separate places. Because it says they are appointed over the administration of the province while Daniel was in the king's court. He's somewhere else. Because you come to chapter 3, and he talks about making this image, but in that it says he set it up on the plain of Dura. This is not where the palace is. This is an entirely different place. Let's see, does that... I don't see Dura on this map, but it's an entirely different place. So that's why Daniel is not included in, and that's one of the things that the critics throw out. Daniel should have been included. Perfectly logical answer for that. But here's another thing about this image or this statue. What put the bug in his ear to build such a statue? His dream, exactly. Oh, Daniel said, I'm the head of gold. Let's just make a statue out of gold. Now, you got to think about this logically, literally. My translation says the height was 60 cubits and its width was 6 cubits. This thing is 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That's a big old statue.
He said I have in my notes, and it's an 8-story building.
Good to know. I didn't know that.
And I also had in my notes, too, that some time had passed between when he had the dream and when he started building the statue.
Probably did. It probably wasn't like, the next day he went out and did. No, I would.
16 years passed. Why that? I don't know why.
I haven't read that. My opinion is, and I could change it if I read something else on that. My opinion is it wasn't a great deal of time because this dream is still in his mind.
Unless it took that long to build it.
Well, that's possible. They may have set out to build it right away.
Right. And
it may have taken a lot longer. So, but here's another interesting thought, and this might be grabbing at straws a little bit, but it's just an interesting thought. When you go on down to verse 5 and you hear the instruments that's going to be played, again, there are 6 instruments. This thing is 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide. So you got 6 and 6 and 6. That may not have anything to do with it, but that's just an interesting thought. But there's 6 instruments. And, what's comical to me is those same 6 instruments are mentioned over and over and over. You just say, when they play the music, but no, there has to be something to those 6 instruments. But anyway.
Does it name them?
Yeah.
several times. Verse 5, the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, whatever that is, the psaltery, and the bagpipe. And then it adds all kinds of music, but those 6 are mentioned every time that when they play these 6 instruments, they fall down. We played these 6 instruments, and they didn't fall down. That same 6 is mentioned every time. But here's the reason that that this whole thing came about, and that's in verse 8, and we see it's jealousy. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. We were already told they were 10 times better than any of the others, and so they're jealous. And they know they're Jews, and they know that they pray, and they know that they won't bow down. They know that they eat different food.
And they know that they're smarter than them.
Yeah, exactly. And so, hey, get these guys over here. They don't play fair. So Nebuchadnezzar doesn't even act like he knows who they are. Just throw them in the furnace. Just get rid of them. And then there, you know how that plays out. They heat it 7 times harder, and then once throw them in there, get killed. And then it says that they are walking. I see him, he says, walking around, and the 4th is like the son of the gods. Now the question comes up, is that a pre-incarnate Jesus, or is that just an angel? My opinion is that I believe it's pre-incarnate Jesus, and I believe Jesus appears in different instances as he is needed. Like he appeared a different way to Joshua, he appeared a different way to Hagar, he appeared a different way here. But could it be an angel? It could be, because an angel shut the lions' mouths. So, that's you can believe either one of those. It could be either. But it said the fire had no effect on their bodies. As the song goes, they didn't bend, they didn't bow, they didn't burn. So, any other thoughts on that before we go on? I got about 5-6 minutes. And again, and I may not get to any more of that, but when we get to Daniel in the lion's den, again, it's jealousy. It's the reason that he is brought up and ends up being thrown in the lion's den. It's jealousy again. In chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3 of chapter 4 goes with the account in chapter 3. The next account begins in verse 4 of chapter 4. And I do believe that there is a period of time between this. Because beginning in verse 4 of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's telling the story. Now, whether he wrote this and Daniel included it, which I've read in some of the commentaries, if that's true, then this is other than Luke, it's the only Gentile writer in the Bible, only other Gentile writer. But either way, Nebuchadnezzar's telling the story. He may be writing it down, or he may be dictating it to Daniel. We don't know. But in verse 7, we see, or in verse 6, I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men, that they may be. He had another dream, this weird dream. This time he tells them what the dream is. So they brought the Magians and the conjurers and the Chaldeans and the diviners in, and he told them what the dream was. But it is Daniel who he calls in verse 9 Belteshazzar. I know that the Spirit of your God is in you. And so he specifically, they couldn't make known the interpretation, but Daniel, Belteshazzar did. And I've always found this prophecy or this dream really intriguing to try to figure out, but you don't have to figure out because Daniel tells him it is. You go on over in the chapter, Daniel tells him exactly what it is. But here's the thing that I want to point out on that. Verse 26. In that command to leave the stump with the root of the tree, Daniel says, your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Once you admit, once you agree that heaven, that God is the ruler, then your kingdom will continue. But if you don't, it won't. He said, my advice to you, verse 27, break away from your sins, whatever his sins were doing, by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. This is what's going to happen unless you repent and change. So all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. Then verse 29 says 12 months later. And I think that he actually, in that 12 month time, perhaps he heeded Daniel's advice. Perhaps he was doing the things that Daniel told him to do. But in 12 months, then he says, look what I've done. And then, he becomes like the beast of the field. And I don't really have time to get into the writing on the wall, but it's, it goes along with what we just read in chapter 4. We have a king who doesn't listen. Or as we see in Exodus, I don't remember if it's chapter 1 or chapter 2, it says, there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who knew not Joseph. He didn't know and he didn't care. So, let me just say this quickly in application. If you have questions, once we turn off, we'll cover anything you want to cover. The question we have to ask about Daniel is, do we have a God who, as Isaiah 46 verses 9 and 10 says, knows the end from the beginning? Do we have a God who reveals, as Amos 3 verse 7 says, his secrets to his prophets and thus to his people? And the answer is yes, we do. Daniel teaches us that God is sovereign. He is over all things and all people. Daniel teaches us, as we've said, how to live in exile. I mean, encourage you, and I know here in Huckleberry you probably get tired of hearing me say that, but let me encourage you to read 1 and 2 Peter. Those are words for our day. How to live when persecution is arising. And the bottom line, the overall message of the book of Daniel is about God's control of the future, but the underlying message is we can be faithful while we're in exile. We can do this. Daniel did it. Ezekiel did it. We can do it. The book of Daniel is an enigma. It's probably the most prophetic book in the Old Testament next to Isaiah, but it's also one of the most practical books in the Old Testament. It would come in quite handy as we're facing some very difficult times in our future. But I want to tell you this. It's like this note I have in my Bible, the book of Ephesians. Don't wait until you can understand it to believe it. Believe it, and then God will lead you to understand it. So any comments or questions or anything about the rest of this we didn't get to? I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose anyway. All right, well, let's pray, and then if you have anything else you want to talk about, we can do that. Father, thank you for Daniel. I mean, what an example for us. A young